Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more 40k lore. But before that, it's giveaway time. I have 3 wonderful prizes here: an Emperor's stained glass, a wallet, and a pair of glass cups with 40k motifs on them, courtesy of Half Moon Bay. And of course, with 3 prizes, there will be 3 winners. All you have to do to be in with a chance of winning one of these prizes is to leave a comment below telling me about your favorite psyker, considering that psykers in general is the topic for today's 40k lore video. And please also leave an email address so that I can contact the winners, whom, by the way, will be decided more or less at random / a pinch of personal bias. Now then, let us get on to today's topic: psykers. Not any psykers in particular, like named individuals or even particular types, like astropaths or sanctioned psykers. Rather, we're going to be talking about psykers in general, the term, what it means, how the Imperium deals with them, and so on. So the natural question to begin with then is, what is a psyker? Well, it is essentially a catch-all classification for any individual member of a species that has developed the ability to channel the power of the warp through a relatively stable mutation. And that is around about as specific as we can get, which leaves the term rather broad, as you can quite clearly imagine. But it kind of has to be that broad because, well, practically any species has the potential to develop this mutation, allowing for the utilization of psychic powers. And it really can affect practically any life form. There are those that appear to be extraordinarily resistant to this form of mutation, but there is no real requirement of intellect or evolution to start utilizing this. There are species of animals with intellects comparable to that of cows, essentially, that have developed extraordinarily stable forms of psychic mutations, allowing some species even to carry out short-aimed jumps through the warp as a form of travel. This would of course mean then that the term psychic could be applied to literally anything, all the way from an Imperial sanctioned psyker to an Orc psyker to an Eldar Farseer to a Hrud to a teleporting cow. In other words, the term itself, generally speaking, is far too vague to be of any real use to anybody. This is why we, generally speaking, divide psykers into various categories: astropaths, sanctioned psykers, pyromancers, farseers, etc. But, well, those will be subject for other videos. Today we are going to be talking about psykers in the broadest, most generalistic term to give you an idea of what precisely a psyker is. So, we've already determined that the ability to utilize psychic powers is in and of itself a biological mutation. Presumably. And I say that because whilst it is clear that the development of psychic powers has a biological element to it, and in some cases it is even a defining trait of the psychic power, like for example a navigator's third eye, we do not know if this is necessarily a 100% biological phenomenon. Because of course, this has to do with the warp, and with the warp, one can never be entirely sure where the rules of our biological reality ends, and the complete and utter nonsense of the warp takes over. And of course, in some cases, the absolute nonsense of the warp is not merely a side effect or a unknown quantity, but the main goddamn goal itself, as in the case of rogue psykers, which have no training or real ability to guide their abilities. They just know how to unleash them in mighty blasts of crazy. And then of course there's the Orc psykers, the weirdboys, which, well, if ever being completely and utterly out of control could be codified and turned into an art form, they would be the perfect example. But I keep speaking about how this mutation allows them to channel the energy of the warp. We'll just leave it at the idea that it is a biological mutation for now, because, well, trying to codify it precisely is more or less impossible. So, this biological mutation allows a being to tap into the warp itself and channel its energies out into the real world. This can have a wide variety of effects and doesn't necessarily have to manifest in a destructive fashion. Though it is probably by far the easiest and therefore also by far the most common. Indeed, there is theoretically no limits to what psychic powers could be utilized for. Healing, construction, moving objects, reconstructing buildings, powering spaceships, technically speaking, peering into the warp, guiding them, etc., etc. Seeing as it is the warp that decides what is and isn't possible, it technically is up to the imaginations of those who are trying to figure out what's possible. But in reality, there are some pretty obvious limitations due to the fact that people simply can't imagine certain things. Common wisdom has dictated that psychic powers are used for this, this, and this, and it is very difficult to unlearn that. Even if you are aware of the fact that psychic powers could technically be channeled into anything, that in and of itself does not mean that you will be able to tell your brain that you can do it. If you've been taught ever since you were a child that something is impossible, even knowing that it is possible later on in life might not necessarily be enough. And of course, once again, that really is the clue. The belief in what you can and cannot do. Now again, there are limitations to mere belief. Certain actions also requires a fair deal of actual knowledge. For example, healing someone or regrowing a lost limb will require a certain understanding of the human biology, because what you're essentially trying to do is to recreate the limb in question. And if you don't understand how the limb is constructed or how it functions, you can't very well recreate it, now can you? Additionally, such an action would probably require a fair bit of time, and the longer you have to actively channel the power, the more unstable it tends to become. As even in the best of circumstances, the human mind was never designed for prolonged exposure to the warp, and that is exactly what psychic powers is. Though in the case of channeling, it is taking that raw energy and turning it into something more useful. Of course, this is a strain upon the mind, and the longer you are expected to do it for, well, literally, the more chaos energy seeps into your body, which is a very bad thing, no matter how your resistance towards it might be. To help cope with this, Psykers, hopefully, will be trained in various ways of dealing with this overflow of energy, both through various warding sigils, often tattooed directly into their skins, or carved, depending on the nature of who applied them, or alternatively applied to the room itself. Specialized chambers filled with various warding sigils and techniques, maybe even the room itself could be constructed from psychically deadening material, would on one hand complicate the process of actually drawing in the powers, but also make it a hell of a lot safer for both the person drawing it in, and, in the case of medical treatment, for the poor bastard receiving it. Whether or not the trade-off would be worth it, well, that depends. How attached were you really to that arm? Attached enough to take the risk of potentially getting dicked over by a keeper of secrets? Quite literally? I don't know. Personally, I think I'd prefer phantom limb syndrome over fully real demon dick syndrome. These complications that are usually involved in channeling one's psychic abilities is another reason why more destructive usages are, well, flat out more common. They're easier. There's still a decent chance of blowing yourself up via a stray fireball, but at least it's less straining than channeling. It's also considerably more intuitive. Whilst channeling, pretty much regardless of what you're using it for, requires constant concentration and usually a decent understanding of what you're doing, releasing something like a fireball or a fiery ethereal blast, well, that is far more emotional than it is rational. And no, in this particular occasion, that is not a dig at a certain other, metaphorically speaking, fire-breathing demographic. Rather, it is the cold, hard facts of the matter. You see, we've talked a lot about how psychic powers might manifest, why they manifest, being a biological mutation, etc., but how does a psyker actually utilize the powers with which he has been, quote-unquote, gifted? Now, once again, we are going to be talking in somewhat general terms, since there are a wide variety of ways of controlling psychic powers. One of the most common is continued meditation and indoctrination, essentially building up a mental framework, a latticework, constructing a gun in your head, essentially. And the idea is that the psychic power in question that you wish to manifest will only be manifested once you pull the metaphorical trigger, thereby setting off a predetermined rota of mental preparations. Kind of muscle memory, once you've gotten so used to carrying out a certain mantra that it becomes almost second nature, that you don't have to actually think about doing the thing you are doing, it becomes natural and automatic. This is, as far as the Imperium is concerned, the safest way of utilizing psychic powers, because it requires a minimum of concentration. It is essentially running a predetermined program with a determined effect. And more often than not, it actually does what you intended to do. The downside is, of course, that this is a very, 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 very time-consuming way of using psychic powers, since you quite literally have to construct a mental image of the thing you want, and then continuously imagine that to the point where it becomes second nature, which can take a long time indeed, and when carrying out certain complex things, like, for example, guiding a spaceship through the warp, even with a mental power specifically designed to do this, as in the case of the navigators, it still takes years, if not decades, of training to even be relatively decent at it. And even then, there is considerable levels of deviation between those who are merely competent and those who are actually good at it. But the key idea behind this way of using psychic powers is the degree of separation. Whenever you're going to be touching the warp directly, bad things have a habit of happening with frightening frequency. Thusly, the more degrees of separation you can put between the psyker and actually directly touching the warp, the better. But as mentioned, this is the trained way of using these powers. The other would be the pure emotions. Psychic powers are often linked directly to the wielder's mental state, or at the very least, their psychological state. For example, violent and psychotic individuals tend to be gifted with the ability to blast things into tiny smithereens, while people that are obsessed with controlling things might be granted mind control abilities. It is unclear whether or not it is the ability that alters the psyche to be something it prefers or is useful to, or if the ability itself is altered by the psyche of the person using it, but there does certainly seem to be a certain correlation, especially in regards to the more potent psychic powers. The more powerful a psyker is, the more likely he is to be rather unstable, mentally speaking. And without any form of training, the primary way these individuals draw upon their powers is simply to let loose these emotions and blast out streams of etheric energy. They essentially allow the warp to act through them with a modicum of control. Basically, instead of trying to create a watering pot with mental rotas and meditation, ye simply just point the high-pressure hose in the general direction of the flower bed and hope for the best. Not the most subtle or necessarily the most effective of ways of using psychic powers, but it is usually the easiest since it doesn't really require any control necessarily, but it's also in return the hardest to actually control and direct. But due to the chaotic nature of uncontrolled psychic powers, it's a bit hard to codify, so let's return to the idea of utilizing mental rotas, control, even perhaps rituals, to try and direct psychic powers and establish degrees of separation. And these degrees, or mental constructs, can of course be created and used in many different ways. So for example, astropaths communicate using a self-invented language of sort, consisting of smells, sounds, pictures, whatever you can really imagine, that they can then blend together utilizing their own built-up language consisting of these elements to decipher and send messages. And when they send a message, most of their own language will get translated into the recipient's language, although not always 100% accurately. This is one of the reasons why you usually want astropaths that are familiar with one another to communicate with one another, since they will essentially develop a form of shorthand, allowing them to interpret one another's messages easier, quicker, and perhaps, most importantly of all, more accurately. In this case, of course, the degree of separation is the abstract system of communication, the language, the smells, the emotions, the pictures, the etc. utilized to convey the message. Within other vile xeno-species, you might have other ways of channeling psychic powers. The Eldar Farseers, for example, utilize a wide array of tools to read the future, to communicate with one another, or utilize their various powers in combat. Usually, this is some form of runic language or iconography, through which they can channel their own psychic powers, granting them, yet again, a degree of separation from the warp. Or, in the case of carrying out particularly complex tasks, where they might utilize more psychic energy, therefore more warp energy, several degrees of separation. Carrying out an advanced ritual to read deep into the future might require several types of focus, a staff, runes, a particular room, for example, or a wonderful little security blanket with huggy little teddy bears embroidered on it. It doesn't really necessarily matter so much what it is as what significance it has to the person using it, and the materials and potentially also the shapes in which it is carved. For example, there are certain items that are better at channeling the warp, there are certain materials that are better at deadening the tides of the warp, and there are certain configurations, icons, writings, pictures, shapes, etc., that might impede the flow of warp energy or increase it. And of course, there are various degrees to all of this. Once you've combined, say, a dozen different pieces, boosting, diminishing, hiding, channeling, etc., you might come up with a lattice work that can focus psychic energy for a very specific task, whilst controlling the flow of said energy very, very precisely and minutely, whilst providing the actual user of said psychic energy a great degree of separation. Now, this is very, very complex and requires a great deal of in-depth understanding of the warp, meaning that it is usually far beyond most human psykers, but certain Xenos races, like the Eldar, have evolved this into quite literally an art form. And I really do mean that in the most literal sense possible. In fact, before they awoke in Slanesh and all got butt-fucked into oblivion, they literally created psychically active paintings, which are essentially the acrylic equivalents of a demonic portal into hell. No fucking wonder their civilization fell, I suppose. However, this is, of course, a very pussy-esque way of approaching the usage of psychic powers. All of this rituals and mental rotas and precautions. Filthy shit, if you ask me. No. The best way of utilizing psychic powers is, of course, doing it the way the orcs do. Rather than worrying about all of this safety nonsense and controlling and directing the powers of the warp. No. Much better to simply turn your psyche into a direct conduit for warp energy. Because after all, who actually wants control over anything? Boring people. That's who. Much better to just let it all go wild. Much more fun. Thusly, the weird boy is not so much a manipulator or user of psychic powers as he is a gigantic screaming green hole leading directly into the warp. He is a conduit for pure, unadulterated, uncontrolled, and undirected Wag energies. Now, granted, this is not quite as chaotic an energy as proper warp energy, but it is, if anything, even more unstable, and primarily reliant upon the amount of orc boys nearby. The more excited they get, the more fighty they get, the more rowdy they get, the more energy is poured into the poor orc weird boy, until either he simply just lets it all loose and gawk damn the consequences, or he simply explodes. One or the other. Not always one or the other voluntarily, mind you. On some occasions, the warp energy might simply burst forth, without any warning or preamble. On other occasions, the orc psyche might simply not be able to release it quickly enough, and so disappear in a wonderful, flashy green mist, followed presumably by a very large explosion. As you can probably imagine, the predicted consequences of these bursts of psychic energy is not necessarily predictable in the slightest, but they are very, very destructive, which at the end of today is really all the orcs are particularly interested in. And if a weird boy would just so happen to take a few dozen orc boys along with him in an explosion of greenish energy, well, that's their fault for standing too close to the weird boy. Fucking idiots, what can you expect? But despite this somewhat precipitous nature, it isn't actually quite as dangerous as you might at first think, or, well, no, it's exactly as dangerous as you might at first think, but it's not quite as dangerous in a warp corruption sense. Because of course the orcs were designed by the Old Ones, specifically to be a weapon both against the Necrons and Chaos. Thusly, they mentally programmed them, much as in the previous example of building a mental gun to be fired, to only utilize their psychic powers in a certain fashion, by only drawing upon a certain area of the warp, in which the orcs have created their twin gods of Gork and Mork. This means that whilst the results of orc psychic powers are random at best, they never ever draw upon the rest of the chaotic powers of the warp. This means that an orc psyker can never accidentally summon a bloodletter, though bearing in mind there is one small caveat. If the orc psyker explodes and tears a literal hole in the Imperium, which can happen, then that is the exception. But once again, that is not the orc psyker accidentally summoning a bloodletter, that is the accidental death of the orc psyker summoning a bloodletter. Subtle but vital difference. On the other hand, there are those who are fans of the orc way of doing things, but don't worship Gork and Mork. For you see, the forces of chaos has long utilized rogue psykers in their war machine. In this case, they receive very little in the way of actual training, if any. If they're extraordinarily lucky, they might be taken as pupils of another rogue psyker who, through good old-fashioned trial and error, has been able to survive for long enough for, at least, to get a pupil. So, that doesn't necessarily have to mean much, but better than nothing. But, due to the highly limited nature of their training, they are fairly limited in what they can actually do. Beyond developing large blasts of uncontrolled etheric energy, they're not really able to do much else of interest, unless of course they are of one of the more uncomfortable grades of Psykers, which we will get to in but a second. The Force of Chaos then utilize these things as vaguely directional shotguns. They will send them towards the enemy and watch, preferably from a safe distance, as they do their thing, which usually is relatively effective, though it can also often just simply result in the Psykers exploding messily, but details. And besides, it's entirely worth it because when they actually do work, they do tend to be rather devastating, and presuming that they manage to get close enough to the enemy, which utilizing things like psychic shields, etc. is not out of the question, then even if they do explode, well, as long as they do so close enough to the enemy and far enough from their quote-unquote friends, then everything's really worked out just fine. Of course, the Forces of Chaos do occasionally need somewhat more refined psykers, but they usually prefer to simply abduct them, take them from enemy ships during raids, or, if they're very lucky, grab one of the Empire's black ships. This is usually how they acquire astropaths, etc., and occasionally they do train them themselves, but, well, again, Chaos is not necessarily particularly good on the whole organized and ordered training regime thing, so they much prefer to acquire their refined psykers through other more piratical means. And now, let's finish up talking about the grades of Psykers and, of course, the Imperium's black ships. Psykers are divided into various tiers, with Alpha and Alpha Plus being the absolute highest tier. These Psykers also have various degrees within them of power levels, essentially. A Psyker could, potentially, be so powerful as to destroy a goddamn Titan with his mind. Magnus the Red was one such Psyker. Whether or not any actually mortal Psykers could ever reach that level, well, debatable, but they certainly can become very, very powerful indeed. There are examples of psykers being able to mind control hundreds of thousands of individuals directly, simultaneously, which would require a ludicrous amount of power. There are also examples of them literally digging trenches out of the landscape with blasts of psychic energy. Alpha psykers are very powerful, even if you're looking at the lower level of alpha psykers. Under that, of course, we have betas, cox, deltas, epsilons, gammas, etc., etc. The further down you get, the weaker the psyker becomes. Eventually, you arrive at a level where they are little more than street peddlers. You know, wise women being able to read the future, or magicians being just a little bit too good at their job. These psykers do have supernatural abilities, or well, psychic abilities at the very least. For example, the wise woman might actually be able to see the future, like 1 time out of 100, and the magician might actually be able to summon up a card from a deck of cards by making that card travel through the warp and into his hand. But these are minor powers at best. They could only be used for essentially parlor tricks, and they are relatively stable. Whenever you utilize psychic powers, there is always a chance of it doing something very unfortunate indeed, but the lesser the power of the psyker involved, the lesser the danger is. Of course, even if you are gambling with a 1,000,000-to-1 long shot of something bad happening, that doesn't mitigate the fact that you are gambling with something with the destructive potential equivalent to a nuclear warhead lodged firmly between your arse cheeks, but hey, details. Besides, the vast majority of these peddlers of parlor tricks have no actual understanding of what they're doing. In all due likelihood, they don't even understand they are psykers. They will blame the reason why they can occasionally see the future or why they can dream the future or any such nonsense on a wide variety of other factors, be they religious, traditional, etc. Because their powers don't sound like any kind of psychic powers they've ever heard of, so why should they leap to the conclusion that they are psykers? Bearing in mind also that psykers are, generally speaking, feared and loathed and hated throughout the Imperium. However, if one is fortunate/unfortunate enough to be in possession of a level of psychic aptitude that is high enough to be noticed, well, then you've really only got 2 potential futures in an Imperial world. Or, well, 3, depending on the developmental state of said Imperial world. 1, considering it's a bit of a feudal world, you might simply be left outside in the woods to be eaten by wolves, or euthanized on a more civilized planet. 2, you could blow yourself up because you didn't receive any training and you couldn't control your powers. This option could also lead to a vast array of amusing, if also extremely inconvenient, consequences for your neighborhood, like a minor demonic invasion, for example. But not to fear, it's probably going to be a fairly temporary one. Probably. Or 3, you are detected by the Imperium and hauled off to a cell in the deepest, darkest recesses of the planet upon which you live. You will then stay in this cell with an absolute minimum of human contact until one of the Imperium's black ships will deign to stop by, and this could, quite easily, take decades, if one stops by at all. And if you happen to think that your cell was uncomfortable, oh boy, are you in for a treat. The black ships are not designed for comfort in any way, shape, or form. They are designed for one task and one task only: to transport psykers of all kinds of varying degrees safely, relatively speaking, back to Terra for processing. The cells aboard the ship will be lined with psychic dampeners, and the more boisterous individuals will be put into artificially induced comas until their arrival on Terra. Considering the somewhat volatile and dangerous nature of the cargo they are carrying, the personnel aboard the black ships are also not particularly accommodating. They will treat you rough, very rough, and they will not offer any form of solace in the slightest. But if you survive your transportation to Terra and you remain fairly sane, your nightmare might actually end. Possibly. Since now you are once again presented with two different fates. One, you will be determined mentally stable enough, and your powers will be determined stable enough for you to receive training as an Imperial Psyker. Or two, you will be given the ultimate honor, the greatest glory imaginable for any loyal Psyker of the Imperium, the honor of being fed to the God Emperor. Quite literally. Or, well, to his chair, technically speaking. You see, the Golden Throne, the device that actually keeps the Emperor alive, feeds off the souls of Psykers. And you can bet your happy little ass that it doesn't treat them gently whilst it's eating them. 1,000 Psykers are required to be sacrificed in this manner every single day, and in recent history that number might have increased considerably. Some say that it now requires as many as 45,000 Psykers every day to feed the Golden Throne. To answer this increased demand, the number of black ships have also been increased to ply the galaxy and bring back the tribute so desperately required by the Imperium of Man. On one hand, your Psyker will be devoured by a monstrous chair, and it's not going to be pleasant. On the other, you will literally be able to keep the Imperium afloat, at least for another day. Certainly an honourable thing, if not necessarily a fate one might wish for. And on that cheery and downright uplifting note, I'll wrap up this video on Psykers. Do remember to leave the name and perhaps a brief little talk about your favourite Psyker, along with your email address, down in the comments below for a chance of winning the wonderful prizes. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider sharing it around, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.